The cost of living is on the rise here on the local front, with heating bills soaring and transportation fares raised amid Russia's war in Ukraine, a critical labor shortage and reduced public transport revenues. So what are the repercussions of rising heating costs here in Korea? How are authorities seeking to ease the public burden of heating bills? And how is Europe tackling its energy bills? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we touch upon the challenges to the cost of living here in Korea and elsewhere. For more, I have Professor Yang Hee-dong at Ewha Womans University. Professor Yang, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Hi, good afternoon.
I also have Professor Sergio Ascari at the University of Pavia live on the line. Professor Ascari, good to have you with us.
Good afternoon.
Right, Professor Yang, we'll begin with you. Let's start off then with a few words on the hefty heating bills here in South Korea and their repercussions on ordinary households as well as small businesses.
Well, first of all, we need to be aware that heating expenses separate bills from electricity and the city gas. Well, the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy, so-called the MOTIE, has declared and announced that the heating expenses have increased by 54% in a year. That means if you live in an apartment of 66 square meters, that your heating expense will be charged over $500 last December, and it could be even worse in January, and it could be even worse in February. As for the city gas, the government has increased the city gas fees 4 times last year by 42%, and they had increased this city gas fees by 38% in January. As for electricity, well, the electricity has increased by 3 times by 16% last year, and it was increased by 9.5% in January. Well, you know, the bathhouses are very popular in Korea, particularly in the very last developed region. And after COVID-19, the more than 1,000 of bathhouses closed, even though they have struggled a lot. And even in Seoul, more than 300 the bathhouses are closed. So this is really getting worse and worse in this country.
Right, it really is. And Professor Ascari, what can you tell us about soaring energy bills in Italy? I mean, how high have heating costs surged there?
Well, it depends, because in Italy, as well as in the whole of Europe, we have a free market for electricity and gas. And because of the free market, many customers have actually chosen fixed price contracts. So those who chose fixed price contracts before the crisis were basically protected from price increases. But those who did not choose those contracts, which are a minority, like 20–30% of the customers, saw their bills increasing by 70–80%.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, back here in Korea, Professor Yang, what do you believe is behind the escalating energy expenses?
Well, the major problem has occurred from the import of LNG that takes up over 80% of the heating and also 30% about the power generation. And coal gas is the only government company who was allowed to import the LNG. They imported about $50 billion of LNG last year. But this overall expense have increased by double in a single year. Well, the important thing here is import amount has increased only 1% last year, but the overall payment has increased by double because the LNG price has increased almost by double last year. So, you know, the major reason for this high increase of the LNG price is the war with Ukraine and Russia. Well, the good news is that since last October, this price increase has somehow reduced. But we need to watch this price fluctuation very carefully.
Right, of course. And now, Professor Ascari, with regard to the 20 or 30% of people who are unable to shift the fixed price with regard to their energy costs, how is the Italian government seeking to ease the heating burden for those individuals, for those households that would be?
Well, you know, Italy has one of the largest government debt of the world. So our ability to ease the burden is limited. Nevertheless, the government has tried to reduce, to actually subsidize some cost of the gas value chain, like transportation and distribution costs, and also has provided the so-called bonus, meaning a subsidy which is about, let's say, up to 20% of the cost for poorer customers, basically for households with an income of up to about 15,000 euros per year.
Right. Professor Ascari, I hear Italy has also put in place heating restrictions that were starting late last October. Could you tell us a bit about these restrictions?
Well, this is part of a general European Union request to reduce consumption by about 15% with respect to the previous year. As part of this, we had a restriction by, for example, lowering the maximum allowed temperature down to 19 degrees in the houses and 18 degrees in businesses. But in fact, the outcome has been even beyond the objective, because in fact, since September, we have seen reductions of like 20–25% in consumption with respect to previous year. So I think that the high prices have done more than the actual restriction, than the legal restrictions.
I see. Professor Yang, the Union administration, for its part, has pledged energy vouchers and tangible discounts for the less privileged with regard to dealing or easing their heating bills. Could you tell us a bit more about this?
Well, the government has announced that they want to support the socially underprivileged people by voucher business. Well, the socially underprivileged people means there are 7 major categories within this label. The elders aged over 65 years old, and the small kids in age less than 7 years old, and pregnant ladies, and handicapped and serious patients, and the single parent or no parent houses. They are qualified for this government support. Well, how much money they will get supported for the social less or underprivileged houses? Could earn about $100 or $250 at maximum from the government for the sake only for the sake of the heating expenses.
And Professor Yang, how do you respond to calls for an expansion in support measures to include average income households as well as small businesses?
Well, intuitively, it may sound a very good idea to support, the less privileged or underprivileged houses and small businesses, as long as this government has enough the budget. But the problem is the Korean government has warned from IMF or many other credit institutions for the abruptly increasing of the government burdens. For the last 3 years, they had recorded over $100 billion in deficit. So this is really serious, even though the overall government debt is lower than other OECD countries. But the problem is the pace of the increase of this government deficit. So that means Yoon's government has very strong repulsion against abrupt increase of revised supplementary budget. For example, the opposition party has proposed to support $30 billion for the socially underprivileged houses for the heating expenses, but the ruling government has rejected these ideas because they have innate repulsion against this, the revised supplementary budget. So that's a big problem.
Right. Professor Ascari, Italy has also announced windfall taxes on energy company profits. For the sake of our viewers who may not be familiar with this jargon, could you explain the term windfall tax for us? And then do tell us a bit about this measure in Italy and the public response to it.
Well, again, Italy was not the only European country to try to set up these type of taxes. It's basically a tax on excess profits, on profits that go beyond the normal profit level. The problem is that energy importing countries are typically not well equipped in their fiscal systems to impose such taxes. So the tax that was proposed in Italy was relatively low, like 10%, and it was actually challenged in court by energy companies. So the results have been rather limited, I would say. This is, ironically, in comparison with the energy exporting countries, who are very well equipped. I mean, countries that export oil and gas typically have a very good taxation system on energy companies, and they're able to take their excess profits much better than importing countries.
Right, and Professor Yang, staying with windfall taxes, opposition lawmakers here in the country have also proposed a windfall tax. What are your thoughts regarding this proposal, keeping in mind, of course, the situation over in Italy as well?
Well, as the professor said, Italy has charged about 25% of profit as long as the companies earned more than 5 million euros in the last 6 months between October and March of this year. Well, I should say that this proposition or proposal has both pros and cons. Well, the major solid reason behind this proposal is, some of the oil refining companies in Korea paid over 1,000% of special bonus because they earned a lot of money. For example, S-Oil, one of the top 3 oil refiners, earned about the 55% increase in their sales revenue and about 60% increase in their profit. So their bonuses were 1,000% last year, even though lots of people or households suffered from the abrupt increase of the heating expenses. And secondly, as I already said, many other European countries has charged this windfall tax. And the further reason for this proposition is about 2008, when we had the financial crisis, the oil refining companies in Korea has organized 10 million special funds to support the less privileged people, to support their heating expenses. But the limitation of this idea, the windfall tax, is when these oil refining companies had about 4.5 billion deficit in the year 2020 when the oil prices were very low, no one cared, right? And why this time they should support this less or underprivileged people with this windfall tax. Number 2 is the European model is quite different from the Western the oil refining company, because the Western oil refining companies also mine the crude oils. So they have relatively more broader and more comprehensive business models compared to Korean oil refiners. And the third limitation over this argument is, all these Korean oil refining companies have their own the shareholders, and this decision may cause some breach of trust against their stakeholders. That's why, all the oil refining companies have the repulsion about these ideas, and including the ruling parties. So that's what happens with this proposition.
Right, I see. Moving forward, Professor Ascari, Italy's dependence on gas for Russia, that is, dependence on Russia for gas, has stood at some 40% prior to the latter's war in Ukraine. And do correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand Italy's dependence has been tangibly reduced in recent times. Could you tell us how this was possible?
As I said, first of all, we had a significant decline in consumption, like 25%. Now it's about 25% in the last 4 months. So this helped a lot, of course. This makes the most of the reduction of dependence on Russia. And then we had some increase supplies from other sources, a little bit from Algeria, but mostly from Norway, and even more from LNG. Unlike in Korea, LNG is a minor supplier in Italy, and in Europe, but overall Europe increased its LNG supplies by about 50%, so that helped a lot. And finally, we also had an increase in supplies from Azerbaijan, basically from the Caspian region.
So essentially you have diversified your markets then. Professor Yang, back here in the country, the cost of transportation, especially in the capital city, is on the rise. Taxi fares were raised last week, and come April, subway and bus fares will follow suit. Are these measures, Professor Yang, inevitable, do you think?
Well, first of all, we need to consider about the serious attitude of the Korean government against inflation. In January, our CPI and consumer price index has increased by 5.2% in January. That is 9 months consecutive price increase over 5%, which is pretty high levels in terms of inflation. Particularly, electricity and gas and faucet waters have increased by 28%, 3%, which is the largest increase since 2010. So, well, there is a high demand for the increase of this public transportation due to increase of oil prices and gas prices. But that's not the only factor to decide on the price increase of this public transportation, because its impact on the consumer price index. And besides, the Minister of Internal Affairs have advised, not warned, advised all the municipals and the provincial, the governors to be restrictive about the price increases over these public utilities and public services. That means the Korean government has a very serious concerns about the potential impact of all these oil prices and LNG and electricity, and also the public utilities over the consumer price index. So if you ask me, all these measures are inevitable, well, it depends on the attitude of the Korean government against inflation threat.
Right. And Professor Ascari, according to a Bloomberg report, the average cost that would be of making a pizza margarita surged 30% at the end of 2022 on year. Now, that being said, what can you tell us about the challenges related to the cost of living there in Italy for the average person and the government's response efforts?
Well, we are certainly being hit because the problem is not just energy. Of course, we have a general inflation which is higher than in Korea, I understand. Now we are close to 10%. Fortunately, it's already easing a little bit, but definitely it's not an easy situation. And but apparently after the pandemic, this is not triggering major complaints. I mean, of course, people are complaining, but that it's not as strong as one may expect maybe before the pandemic.
Right. Professor Yang, broadly speaking, what are the risks of a full-fledged recession here in Korea this year?
Well, I should say that lots of people are really pessimistic for the economic growth of Korea this year and also the next year. Well, our potential growth rate is about 2%. That is a maximum amount of potential growth if we use the maximum levels of all the resources. But the BOK, Bank of Korea, predicted that our economic growth will be about 1.7% this year. OECD has predicted last November that our economic growth will be about 1.3%, even though the global average is about 2.2%. That means our economic growth will be even lower than the average of the world. But the problem is Korean government has very, very limited, right, the reactions, all this pessimistic forecasting. For example, two major reactions from the government side, the fiscal policy and financial policy. Fiscal policy means government will consume their budget. But the problem of the Korean government, as I already said, is they have very strong repulsion against government consumption, because for the last 3 years, the government suffered over the $100 billion of the government deficit. So the only policy they may have in their hands is financial policy that controls over the financial liquidity by interest rate. But the problem is we also suffer a lot of very high interest rate, right, due to the high interest rate in the United States. So current government is almost, really at the dead end with all the measures in terms of fiscal and financial policy to deal with all these positive pessimistic for the economic growth in Korea.
Right. And Professor Ascari, with inflation as hovering above 10% there in Italy, what are Italy's risks of a recession this year, do you think?
There were forecasts of recession. Now, apparently, we are, I would say, about zero growth, which is, we may have a technical recession, but a very minor one, so things are going better than expected. I must not say that, well, I don't know what the feeling in Korea, but overall in Europe, we have the feeling that war is really close to us. So this will definitely affect the people's perception of what's happening, both on the energy prices and more generally about the economic situation. We know this is a difficult economic situation, but we know that we are very close to war. And so what we are bearing is, I would say, very little if compared to what Ukraine is suffering. And you know, Ukraine is very close to us. We have millions of Ukrainians in the European countries, and we feel we are close to them. So this is definitely affecting people's perception of the current situation.
Right, of course it is the situation there. Professor Yang, very briefly speaking, how should Korea, for its part, seek to weather this year's economic uncertainties, do you think?
Well, they already mentioned about the government's reactions to this pessimistic forecasting in terms of fiscal and funding policy. And the other issue is our high dependency on the export for the sake of GDP. Our dependency on GDP from the export is over 40%, which is very high compared to Japan, even to China. Well, Japan had a problem with the Plaza Agreement in 1985. They had only 50% in the export dependency. China now has only 20% in the export for the GDP. Why am I talking about the dependence of export? Well, in January, our trade deficit amounted to $10 billion, which is the largest in the current history. And this is a 10 months consecutive trade deficit in Korea, which is very serious for the growth of our GDP and economic situations. And second factor for our economic growth is a very high household debt. Our house debt is ranked number 3 in the world with 104%. That means our household debt is even greater than the overall GDP level in Korea. Well, as I already mentioned, that we have very high interest rate, and most of the household debt is about the real estate purchase. So lots of households are really suffering from the high payment of the interest because they loaned a lot of money from the banks to buy their houses. That may impact negatively on the consumption level in the domestic market. So that means high interest rate will impact on the consumption in the domestic market. And besides, we also suffered a lot from the export. So both the poor, situations in both of domestic consumption and export make a very critical damage on our economic growth. That's a big, big concern.
Right. Hopefully things will get better in the near future then. All right, Professor Yang, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Ascari, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invitation.
Right. Well, that ends Wednesday's edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow. That would be Thursday.